Listeners community. And I am David J. Bland. I'm going to be using, more of a casual setting for these. We're going to have, a mural board sometimes. You can come in and hang out with us and ask questions as we go. So let's go ahead and jump in. This is kind of deep diving in behind what's going on with testing business ideas. And so a lot of my coaching and a lot of things are behind the scenes. Just give you kind of a sneak peek of kind of what's going on, the kind of questions I'm getting asked. And for this topic today, we're going to be jumping into experiment sequences. This is something that keeps coming up time and time again. I get asked on podcasts about this. I get asked in my coaching about this. And I get emails about this. So I just wanted to kind of hang out and entertain any questions that anyone has about the sequencing. So in the book, you'll notice that we have sequences that are across the spread in the book. And the way that works is basically we have these things that go from, what have I seen from my coaching and what have I seen from being around teams of different types, and how do they connect one experiment to another, and how do they build off of what happens, when I run an experiment? How do I take what I've learned, and how do I kind of take that learning and put it into action, use that to inform the next experiment? And so I just kind of wanted to dive in on these a little bit and give, I guess, a bit more explanation. The way this worked into the book, it was really a late addition into the book. It wasn't something I was even planning on adding because I had all the pairings and everything, and that's the way I approached my coaching. But people had the need for, more sequencing, and so we wanted to give a little more guidance as to what happens when you connect one experiment to the next. And so essentially, if you come into these, we'll just start with something like, we'll start with a pretty common one. Let's just start with B2C software. And I'll try to draw a little bit for everyone today. So when you think about B2C software, there are some like standard flows that I've seen people use to go test things for that are business to consumer software related. And what I normally see is at the beginning, there's some sort of open-ended exploration. And that's usually in the discovery section of the experiment library. And so what's really common is something like a customer interview. So, the teams will do somewhere between, 15 to 20 customer interviews, and then they'll try to use what they've learned from that to inform the next thing. And so what happens in that little arrow, there's quite a bit that happens, to be clear. What tends to happen is the teams are, they're pairing on these customer interviews. They're taking great notes. They usually have a defined segment that we've talked about. And so we kind of go through this, some of the topics I've covered before, which are, are they aware of the problem? Or do they have the problem? Are they aware? They're actively seeking a solution. And so they go through this customer interview process, usually around 15 to 20, because we want to hear kind of the same thing different ways. And we want to hear that a series of times. So usually by the fifth interview, you kind of hear the same thing said different ways. Then you start to get some themes. And so if you do that times three, it's not, or 3 or 4, it's not statistically significant. You start to get some directional evidence on whether or not there are themes there. So what typically happens is we'll use that information and the team will come back and they'll synthesize that. And so when they synthesize that, they take what they've learned and they use the words, we call it voice of the customer sometimes, or we use different words to frame it. But basically they're using the words that they've seen said in different ways. They try to come to some sort of common language from the customer's point of view, not from the business's point of view, from the customer's point of view, and use that in marketing copy, which usually ends up being an ad, and the ad points to the landing page. Okay. So this is a really common flow I see in B2C software where, we're taking the notes, right, that we have from the customer interviews, and we're going through that and synthesizing it. And there are different ways I kind of describe it in the book. Sometimes we do affinity sorting. and grouping. It's more of an open-ended group is what we're usually doing. If we're a little further along and we're doing some kind of preference and prioritization, we might also be pairing something with that, and we have a more list of kind of most cared about features and things like that. But we're taking this and we're using it to inform the copy, on our ads, right? And so I think some of the teams, we treat experimentation almost like it's a one-off thing, and we don't necessarily use what we've generated in evidence and insights to inform the next one. And so what I'm trying to stress with the sequencing is, look, you can take the quotes from the interviews and you can use that in the copy for your ad and your landing page. Now, I would say when I wrote the book, this ends up being kind of more of an and instead of we run the ad and it goes nowhere and then we add the landing page. What I see normally now in my coaching is that that's usually kind of paired together. The things that you read back in kind of the early lean startup book, a lot of that stuff, either Google and Meta and all these companies have kind of clamped down on a lot of the practices that were evangelized back then. So for example, if you read like Tim Ferriss's work, right, you'll see things like, oh, I just ran a bunch of ads and they didn't go to anywhere, and I looked at the click-through rates. Well, nowadays, you try to run an ad that goes to nowhere, you're pretty much your ad's going to get declined. It's not going to get approved, from my experience, what I've seen. And so I've had some clients I was coaching, and they just like, oh, we just want to spin up a bunch of Google ads. Well, those Google ads have to point somewhere that's legitimate, because what happens is Google will go and look at that reference link, and then they'll look at that link and make sure, okay, do you have all the core parts of, let's say, a landing page? And Google goes back and forth. Sometimes I feel like they love landing pages because of SEO stuff, and then I feel like sometimes the algorithm changes and they hate landing pages. And so it kind of varies. It's not like a standard static thing, I've noticed over the years. But usually what happens is we're taking what we've learned and we're from the interviews, we're using that to inform the copy of our ad and our landing page. And it's really important that these match, okay? So when you think of that sequence, you want the copy in the ad to also match the copy in the landing page. Because what can happen is if it's different, you might have a really good click-through rate on your ad. And then when you come to a landing page with a call to action, and let's say you're trying to get an email list or try to, you want to interview some people that are signing up for your landing page, if the copy is somewhat different, then they'll feel as if, well, I clicked on this expecting a thing, and what I'm being shown is different. And so I've seen a really high churn out from my teams where they're really puzzled that, oh, the ads are performing so well, but why is nobody converting on our page? Quite often it's because the value prop on the page doesn't match the ad, and which also doesn't match what we heard from a voice of the customer point of view. So when you trace this back as far as like the beginning of a sequence, you want to make sure that the words you're using in the ad are also indicative of what you're showing on the page. Now, when you A/B testing, it gets a little more complicated, because if you're A/B testing ads, you have to make sure your A/B tests line up, because you don't want to necessarily split test an ad, and the customer sees a different version of that value prop, and then they land on a page with a different version. So there is a bit of integration there that you have to sort out, that you're seeing, even if you A/B testing, you're seeing a version that's going to a similar version on your page with a call to action. So from there, what I see in software from a sequence point of view is once you get, let's say you had, we're going to say 100 subscribers or 100 people that call to action, right? So the call to action, the currency there is the email. So now you're moving from, okay, now I have emails of people that are interested. And it's not a strong, it's not super strong evidence, but it's some, right? They're giving up something. So there's light evidence here with them clicking, right? There's light evidence here with them typing in their email, but you kind of ladder up on the evidence scale. And you normally don't go from really light evidence to really strong evidence. It's usually, it takes time, right? So you go from, well, people are willing to talk to me, so they're willing to click on something, to they're willing to put it in their email. They're willing to spend more time with me after that. They're willing to, obviously prepay or do something eventually. But I've heard a lot of this conflicting advice from people saying, well, you have to charge from day one and all this. It's pretty blanket statement. I've noticed it's a little more nuanced than that. So what I try to do is ladder up over time. The way I describe that in the book is we're going from weak evidence to strong evidence. I don't use that framing as much anymore. when I do talk about evidence, I talk about light versus strong instead of weak versus strong. But even in that context, they're just it's not binary. There's gradations of evidence over time, and I'm looking for more directional. Are we moving to a situation where people are really going to pay? Because what I've seen as a mistake here is people will run the sequence, let's say, down to an email campaign, and then they'll stop. They'll go off and build for months, maybe a year, and then they'll come back to that group and expect them to purchase. And in reality, that's not how that works. Usually, you have to keep people engaged. So, for example, my team was testing out. We do a lot of work with Adobe, right? And so we're testing out new apps at Adobe, right? And so I made this post about Adobe Express and how it started many years ago as an off-brand experiment that I helped coach teams through. And what had happened there is, as soon as we got people signing up, then we started really nurturing that community, right? We didn't just say, okay, now we have, I forget, we had like 1,000 subscribers there. We had many more because what we were doing was really resonating with people. But we didn't just go off and build and then come back to them and try to pitch them, right? We nurtured them. We asked them for more interviews, right? So in this sequence, right, what I would say there is, even here, we went back up and did more interviews, right? And we started talking to people that were signing up, and they just like, can you please, like, I will just throw money at you. Can you please give us this product? Which is a nice, they call it like Cookie Monster moment, where people are just like, want it right now. And obviously we weren't quite fully baked out yet. So we were, like, okay, what is it about this that, because the what, this is more of a quant thing here, right? So when they sign up, that's more of a quant, but we also want to balance that with the qualitative, right? And so we want to know the why. So it's kind of the what and the why. So what happens in that sequence is, we actually can go and email, we can talk to these people because they signed up, and not everyone opens the email, but we had a pretty high, I forget the exact open rate on the emails, but we had a pretty high open rate on the emails. And so my point is, like, when I'm visualizing stuff as a sequence, I think sometimes people see it as a very linear sequence. Like, here are the steps I take, and I just execute on these steps. And I think that's culturally how some of the companies I mentor, even startups, operate. Is we feel as if, okay, it's a series of steps I follow. So, like, I'll sketch out my canvas, and now I'm done with that step. I'll do my assumptions map. I'm done with that step. Now I'll create my experiment plan, and I'm done with that step. I'm going to execute on my plan or my sequence. And in reality, it's much more iterative than that, because what you learn is constantly shaping what you're building and shaping your strategy. And so what I found is, even in this, I'm walking through the B2C software sequence right now. What tends to happen is, we kind of start navigating this, and we might go back, right? Or we might insert something else. And so it's not just, maybe it's the way I drew it in the book or it was illustrated, but it's not like a giant waterfall of experiments. we're going back. So in that interview, what other things we can do there, right, is we can also start showing some of the progress. So usually in these interviews, we have something at the bottom that says, hey, can we contact you again? If you're really interested in this, is it okay if we contact you again? And so in that, we can come back to them. We say, look, we took all your feedback. We thought about the problems you're facing. We're going through this like quant analysis and qual analysis, and we've created something we want you to interact with. Okay. Now, this is what I call a clickable prototype. There are other words for it, but basically what I'm seeing in practice in these sequences is that you can almost curate your early adopters this way. Whereas I think in the past, people are like, oh, I have to go find the segment. And there's a very natural way to do it. If you take their words and you put it in your marketing copy, and then more people like that show up and they're signing up, and then you can also ask them to play with something that's not fully functional, but you can get feedback on it. And so this kind of flow, it's very, it's not necessarily as linear as it seems, because what can happen here is in the clickable, it might be, oh, you know what? this did not resonate at all. You know, so it doesn't make sense to keep going forward. Like, we actually need to go back and rethink some things, because maybe we have the value prop right, but the direction we're trying to use to solve this is no longer, it's just not a good fit. And so we talk about pivots all the time, but what tends to happen is we usually pivot on the customer, the problem, or the solution. And so if you're not married to a solution and you're not necessarily locked in on it yet, which you shouldn't be, but you know, some people are. But if you're not locked in on that, you're willing to kind of revisit, you know, what this could be. So this might be, you know, a few different loops of going back and refining. Okay, we think we finally got to a solution that it like delivers on this value proposition, even though it's not completely finished yet. It's at a stage where, at the fidelity it is, we're getting good signals that this is something that could work. Now, here at the clickable level, what you're noticing is like the type of feedback you get is a little different than what you get at just the interview level, because people get to interact with stuff, and usually it becomes, I find, a more like a stronger signal whether this is something that's going to work or not, just by that lightweight interaction. Now, you have to be careful with it, because you also don't want people saying, oh, I want that red versus blue and a bunch of usability feedback. You want feedback on value. And so, you know, just think about that when you're going through a sequence. Now, I don't always agree with myself. So when I think about what I see today versus when I published the book, I don't see people doing mock sales anymore. It's a lot of effort. I would say it's one of those experiments where, if you think about testing with your customers versus testing on your customers, it kind of steers towards testing on a bit, because there is an element of it's simulated sales. And then at the end, you're like, okay, well, I can't actually process your payment information because this isn't live yet. That can burn a lot of bridges, and can, especially with my B2B clients, that would burn a lot of their customers. So I don't see mock sale really being used. What I do see is I see people going from here to here, right? So they might do something where, okay, we can't build this entire thing out yet, but let's do a version of it. So it might be a Wizard of Oz. It also might be something like a single feature, right? You know, a mashup. But basically what I'm seeing is, I'm seeing them take, like, once we get the clickable thing sorted a bit, then we want to take that further, and we want it to be closer to real life. Okay. We want it to have a real value exchange. And so what I'm showing you here is kind of just one example of a sequence. And even though it comes off kind of straightforward in the book, in reality, it's not just a series of steps I follow in a plan that I execute on, that therefore we're going to be okay because we've thought out all of our experiments. Because while I want teams to think ahead a few steps, I also want them to have an open mind, where if something doesn't go as planned, or we have new insights, or something fails, that we're willing to go back and rethink what we're doing and redesign before we go forward again.